We'll give it a minute for the participants, for the audience to trickle in. I see them entering the webinar. So let's give it a minute. Okay, I see the numbers still going up. That's good. Okay. Well, we are at 9:01, so we're going to start our webinar promptly. Good morning and good evening to everyone in Asia, and good afternoon to people who are tuning in from Europe. Thank you very much for joining on this beautiful Thursday. My name is Yun Sun. I'm the moderator of the session. I'm also the director of the China program and co-director of East Asia program here at Stimson Center, where our China program is dedicated to the analysis and understanding of the Chinese foreign policy. So a lot of you have tuned in 2 weeks ago for our in-person seminar on Xi Jinping's Sinocentrism and the China-Russia relations. 2 weeks ago, that was with Professor Sergei Radchenko. And today we are changing the attention, we're changing the focus a little bit to focus on a different region or sub-region, if you will, that is a priority or prioritize the regional neighborhoods for China. So this project is based on a book that Gil, Danielle, and I produced together, but basically focusing on the analysis of Xi Jinping's foreign policy, his grand strategy, and the concept of Sinocentrism and how it plays out in China's external relations. So today we are going to focus our attention on Southeast Asia and how China's role and China's policy towards the region have evolved, especially under Xi Jinping since 2013. I think we all know that Southeast Asia is I would say, the area with the most heated contention or the competition between US and China because while it's traditionally seen, well, at least the maritime Southeast Asia traditionally has been seen as a part of a US sphere of influence. And for China, when China looks at Southeast Asia, it's just a natural extension of China's influence, if not China's territory. And there's a very long, complicated history between China and at least the mainland Southeast Asia. Since the introduction of the concept of great power competition about two administrations ago, we're also seeing that Southeast Asia is increasingly becoming the frontline story of how this competition is or is not playing out. And people have compared the strategy between first Trump term and the Biden administration, and now looking at the second Trump administration and see how each administration has excelled or failed in different categories or different domains in their competition with China in Southeast Asia. And I think in this discussion about great power competition, we often miss the story from Southeast Asia, right? What are Southeast Asian nations' priorities? What are their preferences? Well, we understand that their preference is one statement, don't force us to choose. And you often react with a counter argument that, well, it's great to have choices. So how has Southeast Asia been reacting to Xi Jinping's reach with Sinocentrism and trying to expand China's geopolitical, geoeconomic, and in some cases, I would say security and military influence across the region? I think that will be a very interesting focus of the discussion today. So to discuss these topics, we have three terrific and I would say top-notch experts in this particular field to share their observations with us. To begin with, our dear leader for the book project, Professor Gilbert Rozman, who is a trained sociologist and has been the editor-in-chief of the ASEAN Forum, which is a bi-monthly online journal on international relations in the Indo-Pacific region. He taught at Princeton for 43 years from 1970 to 2013. And he specializes on Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Russia, South Korea, including modernization, national identity, mutual perceptions, regionalism, and strategic thinking. So as you can imagine, a lot of these angles can be very adaptly applied in Southeast Asia as well. And we also have Professor Danielle Cohen, who is currently teaching politics and history at Lake Forest College. Her research interest includes the politics of East Asia, demographic policy, and Chinese foreign policy. He's a frequent contributor to the ASEAN Forum, where he oversees the country report to China. Previously, he worked as a junior fellow at the China program at the Carnegie Endowment. She received her PhD in government from Cornell University. Last but not least, our old friend, old in terms of the times that we've known each other from Brookings years, Professor Joseph Liu, who is a Tan Kah Kee Chair in Comparative and International Politics at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He's a professor and former dean at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies and currently Dean of College of Humanitarians, Arts, and Social Sciences at NTU Singapore. He held the inaugural Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asia Studies at Brookings Institution in Washington, where he was also a senior fellow in the foreign policy program. I think that's also when we overlapped at Brookings. So as you can tell that we have three outstanding experts to unpack the complicated issue of Chinese grand strategy in Southeast Asia, how the region is responding, and what it means for U.S.-China great power competition. So without further ado, I would like to give the screen to Professor Gilbert Rozman to lay us some groundwork in terms of the concept of Xi Jinping's Sinocentrism and what it means and what is the goal of the book that we jointly produced. Then we'll go to Danielle to focus on China's policy, Xi Jinping's grand strategy in Southeast Asia, and then we'll leave it to Professor Liu to expand the conversation to tell us how the region's responding to it, and what are some of the historical patterns that we're seeing evolving in the region. We do have the Q&A function, so feel free to channel your questions through the Q&A functions, and we will get to the questions during the Q&A. Thank you, Gil. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun. And what a pleasure to be here with you and Danielle, with whom I enjoyed working on this book. This is the fourth in a series of 4 books on the transformation of Asia between 2012, 2013, and 2024. And one deals with Russia, one South Korea, one Japan, and now the China book. And Yoon covered the U.S. role in Asia as seen from China, and I worked on Northeast Asia, and Danielle covered Southeast Asia, India, and Australia. And we also had Gaia Christofferson, who joined us to cover Central Asia in a single chapter. Each of us wrote 3 chapters in which we looked at the transformation of thinking in China through Chinese sources toward part of the neighboring regions. And what we found was an intensification of Sinocentrism. So we tried to figure out what is Sinocentrism, understanding that it isn't specifically identified by the Chinese sources because they're hesitant to indicate that China has a strategy of this nature. We wanted to know how it has evolved or intensified, and how it is applied differently, flexibly, frequently, to the different directions in which Chinese foreign policy operates. So the one question was the nature of China's Sinocentrism. It has some historical antecedent in the Tianxia element of Chinese history, but that's a rough linkage. A lot of things have changed over time. That's not the way really to understand what's going on. We found that it's a hierarchical regional order with China getting a maximal economic leverage, a lot of economic integration, useful for China's ability to influence how other countries operate. It has a very strong cultural or civilizational element, prevents color revolutions, prevents questioning elements of Chinese domestic and foreign policy. It's very different from America First because of the integrated supply chains, the deferential elements that China expects. The wolf warrior element is mixed with sometimes deference, for instance, to Russia. It operates through the language of economic globalization. It poses a real challenge. So we tried to figure it out what it was, not from some fundamental principle, but by looking at what happens year by year in the way Chinese foreign policy and thinking about other countries evolves from Chinese sources, primarily written sources. So we found a takeoff stage in 2013 to 2016. You'll note for Southeast Asia, the South China Sea becomes much more significant in that period. Then we found a taking flight stage, 2017 to 2019. 2020, and that was the Indian border situation arose, the militarization of the South China Sea, and then we found a full flight for Sinocentrism, where it refused to accept the U.S. Free and open Indo-Pacific or Indo-Pacific framework. It was a much more ardent, belligerent in times approach to the region, but it's also a one that changes over time and is flexible. So this is the approach we came up with, looking at it and explaining what we think Sinocentrism is and how it operates. And today we'll emphasize Sinocentrism in Southeast Asia. We do that against the background of the Xi Jinping visit to Moscow. The intensification of Chino-Russian relations. Today is the anniversary of the end of the war as Russia celebrates. It's actually the 9th, but we're almost at the 9th by Russian time. Let's see what we can learn about Southeast Asia. I'm a Northeast Asianist, so I'm listening with great interest as well. I'll pass the floor back to Yun.
Thank you, Gil. So with that, I think that's a perfect segue to what Danielle can share with us. What does it mean for Southeast Asia?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gil, for those remarks. Thank you, Yun, for moderating. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you are. So I wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about 3 key themes that I think really demonstrate Xi's Sinocentrism as it plays out in Southeast Asia. And so the first of these has to do, of course, with the Belt and Road Initiative and China-ASEAN economic cooperation more broadly. So now that the Belt and Road Initiative has seemingly come to refer to every single Chinese investment project anywhere in the world, it can be a little bit hard to remember that once upon a time, when it all started, it was originally much more focused on Southeast Asia as well as on Central Asia. And back then, of course, the official translation was One Belt, One Road. The road referring to Southeast Asia, right? So in early October 2013, when Xi gives a major speech to the Indonesian parliament to celebrate the 10th anniversary of China-ASEAN strategic partnership, he applies what was then the new concept of a community of common destiny to China-ASEAN relations, and he announces the construction of this 21st century maritime Silk Road, which he explicitly links to the ancient Silk Road, maritime Silk Road, to kind of give it that kind of gravitas. And then about a week later, at the 16th ASEAN-China Summit, Premier Li Keqiang lays out the 2+7 framework, which urges China and ASEAN to seek stronger cooperation through strategic mutual trust and mutually beneficial economic development in 7 key issue areas. And so those 2 speeches from the fall of 2013 have really set the stage for China's economic relationship with ASEAN. So thinking about Belt and Road Initiative just a little bit more, when you look at official Chinese statements and when you look at most of the Chinese language analysis, there's a pretty clear insistence that China's pursuit of the Belt and Road Initiative is sincere, and that it will benefit the recipient countries. So it's this clear example of what the Chinese call win-win cooperation. And sort of to that end, Chinese analysts have sometimes seemed completely befuddled as to why recipient countries might object to proposed Belt and Road initiatives, or they've been dismissive of local concerns about potential negative impacts of these large-scale development projects. And so, in reality, of course, Southeast Asia is not a monolith, and the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative on various Southeast Asian countries has been mixed. Last year, Carnegie China put together a really interesting report where they asked 8 analysts from 8 different countries in Southeast Asia to assess whether the Belt and Road Initiative had been positive, negative, or somewhere in between for their countries. And the results were quite mixed. To some extent, those assessments kind of tracked the overall relationship between the individual country and China. But it was interesting to note that even in the case of Thailand, for example, where the scholar they interviewed said that the impact had been generally positive, that scholar still sort of noted some concerns, and there'll be concerns that I think are familiar to us, right? So the potential for these Belt and Road projects to create a debt trap, concerns about potential environmental degradation. So even in cases where the Belt and Road Initiative projects have overall maybe been positive, there still are some substantial concerns. I think it's also worth pointing out that especially in the case of the initial Belt and Road Initiative projects, which were much more focused on infrastructure before this category kind of expanded, these initial infrastructure projects were specifically designed to better connect Southeast Asia with China. And so those physical connections really, between a powerful China and its smaller neighbors are a real durable manifestation, right, of this Sinocentric approach that binds Southeast Asian countries to China. Thinking a little bit more broadly about free trade, of course, we've seen economic ties between China and ASEAN continue to grow much closer over the past 12, 13 years since Xi came to power. An upgraded ASEAN-China FTA went into effect in 2019, and by June of 2020, more than 90% of goods traded between China and ASEAN were tariff-free, and negotiations on a new round of upgrading substantially concluded in October, and they're expected to be finalized soon this year, likely. And then meanwhile, of course, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes all 10 of the ASEAN countries and China, plus Australia, South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand, went into effect in 2022. And I think that those, free trade deals take on increasing significance in the particular moment we're in, with the United States embarking on a strongly protectionist road with high tariffs, right? There's a real contrast there. But overall, the point I want to make is that the trend has been towards closer economic relations between China and ASEAN. The second point I want to touch on is how Sinocentrism has played out in the South China Sea, where we've seen Chinese militarization and increasing aggression. So China's South China Sea policy, as Gil alluded to, took on a much more militarized character with a greater emphasis on artificial island building beginning in 2014, after many years of a much more restrained approach. And the mid-2010s were dominated by the Philippines case seeking international arbitration under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and challenging China's claims to quote-unquote historic rights within its so-called 9-dash line. As that dispute was being adjudicated without China's participation, because China refused to recognize the authority or jurisdiction of the Hague Tribunal, China was also continuing to have maritime disputes with other claimants like Vietnam. So in 2016, the Hague Tribunal released its findings. They were highly favorable to the Philippines, but the Philippines initially ignored that ruling because Duterte had decided to instead seek better ties with China. And at that point, China really doubled down on its island building campaign and its increasingly muscular military presence in an attempt that really has been very successful to build new facts on the ground. And so I hope that you're all familiar with our colleagues over at CSIS and their Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative website. But if you are not, please find your way over there because they have incredible satellite imagery that really allows you to see, month by month, sometimes even island by island, rock by rock, reef by reef, how these military installations have been built up, how these islands have been built, or these features have been built up into artificial islands. And there's really no substitute for seeing these images, which are remarkable. This week, of course, we see new flare-ups. So just this week, right, China and the Philippines are confronting each other again at the Scarborough Shoal. In the past few weeks, we've seen China and the Philippines unfurling flags at Sandy Cay and the Spratlys, which is near Subi Reef. Vietnam then sent a diplomatic note to both the Philippines and China asserting Vietnam's claims to Sandy Cay. So we see that the South China Sea, continues to be, a key point of tension in the region. And so when we think about Sinocentrism in relation to these ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, I think one of the points that stands out is China's insistence that all of its maritime disputes it should be handled through direct bilateral negotiations with individual claimant countries, right, like Vietnam or the Philippines, rather than between China and ASEAN as a whole. And so I think that this really undermines China's claims to support ASEAN unity. I think in reality, China supports ASEAN unity only when it aligns with China's objectives and interests and not in other cases. The final point I want to make, connecting to something that Yun mentioned in her opening remarks, is about the competition of China and the United States for the support of ASEAN and of its member states. So broadly speaking, Chinese analysts tend to believe that ASEAN is hedging between China and the United States, that ASEAN countries tend to want closer economic ties with China, but that many want to maintain a security relationship with the United States, and that overall most countries do not want to pick sides. They don't want to be forced to side with either China or the United States. They want to maintain strategic autonomy. And so Chinese analysts spend a lot of time trying to decipher which of the ASEAN states are leaning towards China and balancing against the United States, which of them are staying neutral, and which are leaning more towards the Chinese side, and how that changes over time. As this is happening, of course, China and the United States are both trying to woo Southeast Asian countries through development deals, like those that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and like US efforts to shore up alliances. For example, during the Biden administration, there was a big emphasis on US, Philippines, Japan security relations. We saw Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, go out to the Philippines and affirm his support for US-Philippine security cooperation. And then, of course, he also visited Japan on the same trip. So it seems like that may be continuing. Chinese analysts warn that intensifying great power competition increases the likelihood that ASEAN and its member states will be compelled to choose sides, even though the US has assured ASEAN that it's not going to ask them to do that. And so clearly China would prefer a situation where all the Southeast Asian states lean towards China. It will accept a situation where states don't pick sides, but it is very much opposed to a situation where any of these states align with the United States against China. And so that too, I think, is a manifestation of China's attempt to build a Sinocentric regional order. And so I think I will stop there, and I look forward to the next set of remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. That's a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed how you braid the South China Sea issue into the strategic vision, because there is a parallel argument from our friends Bilahari that in mainland Southeast Asia, Mekong water issue could be that thread to string the basically braid the whole mainland Southeast Asia into a somewhat different relationship with China. And this concept of great power competition in Southeast Asia, well, we know that's China's vision, a Sinocentric order in the region, if you will. But how does Southeast Asia feel about it? And how is Southeast Asia reacting or use different strategies to counterbalance, I would say, China's geopolitical instinct? And for that question, let's go to Professor Joseph Liu, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuan, and great pleasure for me to be here. I'm the only speaker who's not involved in the book, but I had the pleasure of reading it. Thanks to Gil, who sent me a copy, a soft copy, and it's very well done, very well conceptualized. So congratulations to all three of you. My remarks, I've tried to couch it as on the one hand, just a reaction to the book, but at the same time, as Gil had suggested to me, also just sharing some of my own thoughts on the topic. Yeah, and I will try to do that in condensed form in 15 minutes, hopefully less, and then we can have some time for some questions. Yeah. So first, just some very quick reactions on the book. I really liked a number of things about it. First is the very effective engagement of Chinese sources. Yeah. And I think all of you are to be congratulated for that. Especially in terms of how you've read through and analyzed the works of Chinese scholars, and sort of distilled from them key arguments that would really be helpful for certainly non-Chinese speaking or non-Chinese reading audiences to try to make sense of this whole internal discussion about Sinocentrism, yeah, or at least what it might look like. Second, I thought it was also a very useful, the book was a very useful contrast between the foreign policies of Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and of course Xi Jinping, right? Because I think the timeline of the book was 2013 to 2024, so essentially the Xi Jinping administration. But nevertheless, you provide that context and that evolution, which is very helpful to help us understand that there was Chinese foreign policy before Xi Jinping and all the excitement associated with it. Yeah, and that is very useful as well. So with those thoughts, let me go quickly to my own sort of reactions as they relate to Southeast Asia. Yeah, and I certainly like that you have a very in-depth discussion on Southeast Asia and this panel on the Southeast Asia aspect of it as well. Because if you look at the sort of geopolitical map of Asia, the Asia Pacific region, what do you see? You see a bunch of countries, the Japans, Taiwans, Australia, South Koreas of the world, whose alignments as far as US and China are concerned are pretty much spoken for already. Yeah, to various degrees, but they are very much over the last few years in terms of their policy positions. You could very comfortably place them in the US side of the equation. Yeah. You have India. India is not going to be on anybody's side. Yeah. And there's no point really even trying. I mean, India sees itself as one of the major powers and in relation to the US and China as well. So Southeast Asia is really where it's happening. Yeah, as Yun, you pointed out in your opening remarks. Yeah? And I think that as far as great power rivalry is concerned, of course, the power that can secure Southeast Asia, so to speak, will have a better chance of realizing it and advancing their own strategic objectives in Asia. Now, the question is whether anyone can sort of secure Southeast Asia. Yeah, and so let me make three sort of large points in reaction to the arguments made in the book. The first one is, of course, Xi Jinping's idea of a new regional security architecture for Asia, right, which underpins his conception, rooted in what you all describe as Sinocentrism, or certainly his version of Sinocentrism for the region. And is captured in the phrase translated, right? Asia for the Asians. It is to my mind, a very unfortunate choice of a phrase. Those of you who are familiar with the history of Southeast Asia, you know it conjures up not entirely positive images, the Second World War and the like. So I always say, Southeast Asia, been there, done that, don't like it, right? So that's quite an unfortunate phraseology. But that aside, this whole idea of a new model of great power relations that underpins it. How have regional states responded to it? I think it's safe to say that Southeast Asian states generally have responded in a lukewarm fashion. Yeah, certainly not as enthusiastic as Beijing would have liked. And the reason why is quite simply, for Southeast Asia, the issue is how the existing order can accommodate China, how the existing architecture can accommodate China, and not getting rid of the existing architecture and building a new one, let alone a Sinocentric one. Yeah. So we need to be careful when we read the region's response. The region is certainly supportive of greater a greater role for China to play in the region. Yeah. But at the same time, that should not be mistaken, whether in Washington, in Beijing, in Tokyo, in Canberra, wherever, that should not be mistaken for the region wanting to change the regional architecture in a way that would give rise to a new format with China leading it. Yeah, two very different things. So that's the first issue. The second issue is this, and it's also discussed, I think, in some of the chapters. This notion of China's irrepressible rise on the one hand, and America's inevitable terminal decline on the other. It's it's a Chinese mindset to some extent that has, of course, framed this discussion about a new model for great power relations, right? And it really predated Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi Jinping took it to another level, but you're talking about something that can be traced to the global financial crisis, the 2008 Olympics and the like. Yeah, so it predated him, although he certainly embraced it and accelerated it. Southeast Asian states have never bought into that argument at all. Yeah, never bought into that argument at all. Yes, if you tell us that the distribution of power is changing, yeah, China is becoming more influential simply by virtue of becoming more affluent, richer, can buy weapons, can invest, can give loans, etc. Yeah, of course, yeah. But does that ipso facto equate to a decline in American influence? It's a bit more complicated than that from Southeast Asia's perspective. Yeah, so in that sense, if I may paraphrase, reports of the terminal decline of the United States have been greatly exaggerated as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. Yeah, no doubt the United States has many, many troubles, and I think that my own view is that if the current Trump administration stays its present course, it is going to further undermine American interests and influence and power, not just in the region, but possibly globally as well. But we also have to bear in mind that, of course, until recently, China was closing the gap with the United States. But alas, China itself is now facing a lot of challenges to its economy, which I think we are seeing very small incipient green shoots, but I don't think anyone is of the view that the Chinese economic troubles are about to turn a corner, and the current situation with the Trump tariffs just further complicates the situation for them. Yeah, and on the other hand, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the United States, a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, but as a global power, it still has a very deep reservoir of strength that should not be underestimated. And I can tell you, No one in Southeast Asia underestimates it. You look at the Southeast Asian countries and how they have responded to the Trump tariffs. They're lining up to go to Washington to, if I may put it ever so bluntly, offer tribute to to Trump. Yeah, this is not a response to a power that you think is declining and declining in the terminal way. Yeah, so we need to bear that in mind. Another aspect of this is, of course, China's rise, as far as the region is concerned, is a fact. Yeah, it's now leading economically in a number of high-tech areas. I think you all know the story. I don't have to get into that. It's also trying very hard to build up its military capability commensurate to its growth as a major economic power. Yeah, but as I mentioned, it's going through a lot of economic challenges, and we really have to watch if the current leadership, that is, Xi Jinping, and together with his, I suppose you can call it his economic team, He Lifeng and Ding Xiexiang and the like, how much actual influence they have on Chinese foreign policy or economic policy and trade policy making now, we don't know. But this is presumably the economic team. How much success they're going to have in terms of this effort to rebalance the Chinese economy, that we have to watch very closely. A final point about this great power rivalry, as scholars, one of the frameworks that we have used to understand this is, I suppose, in a sense, power transition, right? Rising power, status quo power. United States being the status quo power, China being the rising power, Thucydides trap, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But what I find interesting is today, with the Trump administration, you're looking at the two top dogs, the two most powerful countries in the world, both of them dissatisfied with the status quo. Yeah, both of them are dissatisfied with the status quo. So it gives an interesting spin to this dynamic of rising and status quo powers, sort of clashing, or the risk of a clash, right? I mean, what do you do now when you have two powers that are actually both dissatisfied with the status quo? One thinks that they've been pillaged, taken advantage of, raped, as the president has said, by everyone, primarily allies. And of course, on the other hand, you have China that believes that, foremost led by the United States, a Western, so-called Western effort to contain it and to keep it from realizing its potential. Yeah. So again, a bit more complex, the dynamics, than just simply power transition. And a last point specific to Southeast Asia, and in a sense, Yun, you stole my thunder already by citing Bilahari, because I was going to say that Danielle hit the nail on the head with a number of key issues. But I would add to that the geopolitics of the greater Mekong region. Yeah, and I think that is very important, arguably even existential for Southeast Asian security, but very often ignored for the sort of bright shining lights of the South China Sea. Why is it so important? Three things here. Number one, the Mekong literally and figuratively flows into the South China Sea. Yeah. If the South China Sea is the major security issue for Southeast Asia, how to get an ASEAN consensus, ASEAN centrality, ASEAN unity is critical to how the region approaches this security challenge, right? I think everyone agrees. Now, therein lies the rub, because to the extent that ASEAN struggles to get unity on this issue, a large part of it is because you have the mainland states who are operating on a very different security landscape, which is their priority. Yeah, it's not the South China Sea, it's the Mekong region. And that leads me to my second point about the Mekong region. Unlike the South China Sea, most external powers are absent from the dynamic of the greater Mekong region. Yeah, I mean so I want to be careful here. Maybe not entirely absent. The Japanese have been trying to do some things there. The US on and off was trying to do some things, but nothing to the scale of the Chinese. Yeah, if you want to talk about the dominance and overshadowing influence of an external power in Southeast Asia. Look at the Mekong, look at China, and you just look at the map. China is the upper riparian state. It literally overlooks the Mekong region, right? So that leads me to my third point, which is that geography favors the big power, not just in terms of size here, but in terms of location, where it's located on the map. Yeah, China can, because of where it's located, because of the technology and resources that it has, it can quite literally control the flow of water through the Mekong 365 days a year. Yeah, with the dams that multiple dams that they've already built, among other things. Yeah. And of course, the problem is, or the challenge is, that a lot of these mainland Southeast Asian states, they are dwarfed by China. China has decided that either we negotiate with them bilaterally, yeah, which they have done, not unlike the South China Sea, but unlike the South China Sea, even multilaterally negotiating with the Mekong powers is no big deal for the Chinese, because they're so dominant there, right? Unlike the South China Sea. So I think that one sort of missing piece, if you will, of an otherwise very robust discussion on the situation in the South China Sea is, again, as Yun, you pointed out, the dynamics in the Mekong region. Yeah. So with that, I will end, and happy to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you for also expand on the issue of Mekong, because as you're absolutely correct, most of the people who look at Southeast Asia do not seem to realize that Mekong is probably the defining issue for the future of at least the mainland Southeast Asia. I think that's tremendous geopolitical implications. Not enough attention is being paid to the issue. So I have a lot of questions myself, but I know that time is limited. Let's go to the Q&A and explore some of the questions there. So Steve Hirsch from Suspended VOA. Hi, Steve. Has a question about China's Malacca dilemma. The question is that while China has been building infrastructure projects, including pipelines, regional transportation networks, ports throughout Southeast Asia, to what extent do you think that will offset or compensate for the China's vulnerability along the Indian Ocean and specifically the Malacca Strait? I have my personal observations, but I want to give the floor to our experts first to hear your view. Any takers? Maybe we'll go to you, Joseph, first.
Okay, just very quickly, I think that you're right to point out that as far as the Chinese are concerned, there's a very acute sense of their weakness as far as the maritime straits around the maritime regions around their country is concerned. Yeah, and that's primarily because the United States is still very dominant. This is why Xi Jinping has placed so much emphasis on the development of a blue water navy, of being able to break past the first and second island chains. This is why this is why China, or Xi Jinping rather, has placed so much emphasis on the anti-corruption campaign with regards to military defense capabilities, yeah, the PLA. Certainly, that whole anti-corruption drive, there's a very clear political sort of element to it. But I do believe that part of it, at least as it relates to the PLA, is really the desire, the urgency of getting the PLA to pull up their socks, to be a professional military, because you're up against the United States, yeah, and you can't be sort of squaring up to your adversary with your so-called paper generals, with ranks that are purchased and that sort of thing. Yeah, so there's that urgency. But at the same time, the Chinese, again, in a reflection of their Malacca Straits dilemma, they are really enhancing their relationship with Central Asia as well. I think there have been some interesting developments, not least of which, I think a couple of years ago, Xi Jinping sort of inaugurated the first China Central Asia summit. Yeah, right under the noses of the Russians. Yeah, while Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine and desperate for whatever sort of assistance the Chinese can give, even just platitudes and diplomatic statements. While Russia has been preoccupied with that, China is trying to assert its presence very successfully, I would say, in Central Asia, which we all know has been the traditional sphere of influence of the Russians. Yeah? So that's also a reflection of the sense that the Chinese have, that they are vulnerable. They're still vulnerable in terms of the waters around them.
Thank you. I agree. Gil and Danielle, do you have anything to add? Okay.
I was just
oh,
going to add,
go ahead.
I agree, that China has really been working on diversifying, the way its access points, so it's not so dependent on goods transiting through this very vulnerable strait. One thing I think that's interesting is to think about how India plays into this. And as Yun mentioned, and Gil, I think India was part of my chapter in the my chapters in the book. And I think one of the things I found most interesting about India was to sort of see how, as Chinese interests are moving through Southeast Asia, and then west into South Asia, right? At the same time that India's interests are moving from its traditional Indian Ocean kind of area east, which then brings it up against Southeast Asia. This is another example of how Southeast Asia is just right in the middle of all these sort of power competitions. And so if you think about the geography of the Strait of Malacca, it borders the Bay of Bengal, right? Which is an area that the Indian Navy is very interested in. Obviously, the Indian Navy is not yet anywhere, close to the to having the capabilities of the Chinese Navy. But when you start to think about India in collaboration with the United States, the kinds of cooperation that might be happening through the Quad, it starts to become sort of just an interesting wrinkle to the story, right? Like, is there another dimension to this where we need to now start thinking about what India might be doing in the Bay of Bengal and how that might start to impact the Strait of Malacca and sort of these maritime interests. So I just wanted to add that one point.
Great. Yeah, one observation that I have is that, well, in many ways, China's Malacca dilemma is indefensible, right? How do you defend against a overwhelmingly superior, well, so far is still superior U.S. Navy? And I think when we talk about Malacca dilemma, it's usually in connection or in conjunction with the Taiwan contingency, that if U.S. and China are already at war, then what would China do, or what capacity does China have to defend its energy transportation? I think in many ways the question is really a null question in terms of how to develop alternatives in Southeast Asia, because one of the argument about the Sino-Myanmar oil and gas pipeline, the original justification is that, well, this will help China to avoid this Malacca dilemma? Well, not really. If you look at the volumes that can be shifted through the pipelines, and the volumes that can be shifted through the sea, there's no comparison. And two, I think the Chinese also very quickly realized after the pipeline was built that if U.S. and China are indeed at war, there's no guarantee that China's our original supply from Middle East in terms of oil and gas can be ensured. And there's also no guarantee that the pipeline through Myanmar will also be operational in the event of a military conflict with the United States. So I think the Chinese solution is more about diversification to avoid this particular sea route, to look north, look at Central Asia as well as Russia, and also diversify its domestic energy composition to focus more on, for example, hydro, solar, wind, as well as nuclear. So that's my preliminary impression. But related to the question of India, Joseph, there's a specific question for you on the comment that you made about India won't be on anyone's side. I think the question is, what are the indicators of Indian neutrality in that push you to make that assessment? So wouldn't India be seeking to align with the West and opposed to China? What do you think? Well, if we look at
Well,
the Ukraine war, I think India's choice was pretty clear that not going to pick a side.
sure. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, is India orientating themselves more to the West and improving their relations, especially with the US? Yes, of course, they're doing that. Yeah, but we have to be careful to think in such binary terms that therefore India is taking a side and is taking the US side. Yeah, I think there are a number of things I would point to. The obvious one, of course, that we are all familiar with is the very robust stand that India has taken on the Ukraine war, specifically to show that they are not taking the side of the West. Yeah. And in fact, their leaders have made it very clear in that respect. Yeah. Number two, less spoken of publicly at least, but the Indians have admitted this as well. When China started pushing into the Himalayas, yeah, a few years ago, it was a reminder to India that you cannot rely on the United States to come and back you when your security is being challenged, yeah, by China. Yeah. And add to that, India's congenital aversion to being allied to one side or the other. Yeah, I think that that may be historical, that may be cultural, whatever it is. I think that we cannot discount that. So I would warn against reading too much into the admitted improvement in India's relations with the United States and with so-called Western powers. Yeah.
I agree with you, Joseph. I wonder whether Gil or Danielle have a comment about that specific question. Well, we basically look at India. Well, I think one thing that you often hear Indian strategists would say when they're asked this question that, well, if there's Taiwan contingency, India, which side are you going to be on? Are you going to play the role of a solid partner in the Indian Ocean and do what we would expect you to deliver? I think the Indians have always been quite hesitant in answering that question. The hesitation is more than obvious, and one of the concern that, well, not the concern, one reply that you often hear from even Indian military or former military leaders has been, well, neighbors cannot be moved. I think what that essentially reflects is a conviction that even if there is a Taiwan contingency, China cannot be eliminated as a geopolitical power in Asia and also on India's border. And if India chose an adversarial relationship with China during this, say, a Taiwan contingency, what would be the reaction after the war is over? and what kind of relationship that will set up. I think that's always a question that people are concerned with. Here's a question potentially, I think Danielle, before you. So a primary framework that China has pursued relationship with mainland Southeast Asia is 南长 cooperation mechanism, right? 南美合作. Do you see that as the primary framework of China, of how China is pursuing relationship with Southeast Asia, or is just one of them? Is this a primary pillar of China's strategy towards the region? And I would also welcome comments from Joseph and Gil.
I think it's an excellent question, and it actually sort of relates to, if I'm allowed to ask the question of the panelists, a question that I had for Professor Liow, right? Which is when you think about these mainland states where the main, I think as you, Professor Liow and Dr. Sun both rightly pointed out, the Mekong framework is so important, right, for these mainland states. And then you have these other states in ASEAN that are claimant countries where they have these concerns in the South China Sea. And so the challenge is always, how do you achieve ASEAN unity, right? Because without unity, you lose a lot of power. And so I suppose if, I'm trying not to punt here, but I genuinely have this question for Professor Liow, which is, how do you think that the 10 member states of ASEAN are navigating this real divergence between what's the primary concern for the mainland states and what's the primary concern for the claimant states? And is there a way to achieve unity, or is it just hopeless?
I ask that question all the time. I don't have honestly, it's we all know how important it is, and no one knows it more than the ASEAN states themselves. Yeah. But at the same time, the diversity of ASEAN, by which I don't just mean, language, political systems, religion, that sort of diversity. I mean diversity in terms of the strategic outlooks and priorities. Yeah. That diversity makes it very difficult. And the thing about ASEAN unity and ASEAN centrality is it is iterative, right? It's not as if you can sort of cast it in stone and it governs every aspect of regional regional activity, right? You painstakingly work to get unity, coherence on one issue. And before you know it, before you can catch your breath, a second issue comes up. And the terms for unity, the terms on which you want to try to cobble together unity are totally different from that first issue that you had to grapple with. Yeah. So this is in the nature of the very complex dynamics that confront the region, and also that diversity that I was talking about. So it is it's easy to criticize ASEAN, to say that, oh, you guys can't get your act together, and to some extent it's true. But in making those criticisms, those of us who do that, and I include myself in it, to be fair to the organization and to the members, if we really try to understand, the complexity of the challenges that they face, and that diversity, I think, it warrants sort of cutting them some slack. So I give you a quick example, right? The Trump tariffs, right? And then ASEAN, of course, the knee-jerk reaction from Anwar, the Malaysian leader, since Malaysia is the chair, says that, oh, we want to try to find a united response and then negotiate with the Americans as a united ASEAN. I mean, first and foremost, Trump didn't impose tariffs on ASEAN. He imposed tariffs on individual countries. So what gives, right? I mean, why do you need to negotiate as ASEAN when it's actually individual countries? Yeah. And there is nothing, to me, there's absolutely nothing wrong and there's no disconnect between a country being committed to ASEAN, but at the same time pursuing bilateral approaches to any given problem, right? Just because I'm a member of ASEAN, does it mean that all my eggs are in the ASEAN basket? I think it would be, personally, I think it would be quite silly for any government to make that sort of commitment. Yeah. So ASEAN has a lot of problems. Unity is one of the biggest ones, and it's very unfortunate that sometimes when the crux of the matter with regards to external powers, when unity is really required, it is absent. The countries can't cobble it together, and they are worse off. The region is worse off for it. That's very unfortunate, but it's also a reflection of the reality, I think.
That's terrific. No, I think you're absolutely correct, Joseph, that ASEAN is so adept in using different combinations of instruments, right? And I think throughout the decades, if not centuries, ASEAN has practiced the ability to use different policy tools to deal with different powers. And I would say that a couple of countries are particularly adept in managing this issue. So that potentially, well, it could perhaps be the topic of Gil's next book, and well, under your leadership, how ASEAN use different instruments to deal with China. I think that will be a fantastic exploration of how smaller states manage great powers in their region.
Yun,
Well,
that's more like your book
oh, okay. Well,
or Joseph's book.
yes, Joseph. Well, to be continued. Well, we are at the end of our hour. We still have a lot of questions to be discussed, so we'll leave it to our next iteration. But I just want to take the time to thank everybody for joining today, and especially for Joseph for staying up late in Singapore. And thanks to my co-authors for this really fascinating and exciting endeavor on this particular book. We hope to see you down the road on our other programs discussing China's foreign policy towards different regions. And please follow Stimson's work and our event schedule. Thank you so much. Have a very good day. Have a very good evening.